This is John Ryman from Oaklandsocialist with the third part of our video slideshow series on why Marxism opposes the method of individual terrorism. In part one of this series, we discussed the classic Marxist view of individual terrorism and the difference between individual terrorism and a genuine armed struggle like that of the NLF and the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War, the Ukrainians fighting Russia's invasion at present, and even guerrilla wars like the one waged by Fidel Castro in Cuba in the 1950s. In part two, we reviewed the disastrous results of the individual terrorist methods in Chile in 1973, in Iran in 1979, and in South Africa during and after the overthrow of apartheid starting in the 1980s. Especially in the case of South Africa and the South African Communist Party, we saw how their use of individual terrorism was really just a cover for reformism and capitulation to capitalism. That is what we will see in looking at those who base themselves on that strategy in Palestine. Before going further, though, we must start by commenting that the forces that really introduced terrorism into the region were British colonialism and their servants, the Zionists. We have dealt with their role many times in the past. Here, it is sufficient to stress that the original resistance to the British and Zionist terrorists was more along the class lines, such as the 1936 Palestinian general strike. However, the British and the Zionists succeeded in crushing mass resistance and thereby drove the Palestinian masses into the arms of middle-class and capitalist nationalists. Out of this situation came the founding of Fatah, which was formed by a layer of middle-class and secular professionals and students in 1959, 11 years after the founding of the State of Israel. After a second defeat for the Palestinians, the so-called Six-Day War of 1967, Fatah became the dominant group of the Palestinians. From the outset, it was linked to some of the different reactionary capitalist Arab states in the region. At least in part because of these links, it could not organize mass struggles such as like the 1936 Palestinian general strike. Instead, Fatah's preferred tactic was individual terrorism. For example, according to the BBC, in 1969, Fatah carried out 2,432 so-called guerrilla attacks on Israel. Those attacks were nothing but a pinprick for Israel itself. This accomplished nothing, at best, towards Palestinian liberation. As a result, by the 1990s, Fatah and the broader Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which it dominated, were drawn into the Oslo so-called peace process. Out of this emerged the Palestine Authority, or PA. Mahmoud Abbas consolidated his power by being the leader of Fatah, the PLO, and the PA all in one. Today, the Palestine Authority is pretty much regarded as collaborators with Israel and U.S. imperialism. The collaboration and corruption of the PLO/PA left a vacuum which was filled by a new and seemingly more militant organization. That was the religious-based Hamas. We have detailed the history and role of Hamas here. Without going into detail, we should just point out that the origins of Hamas lie in the Egyptian-based Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood played no real role in Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation of the West Bank following the 1967 Six-Day War. True to its origins, Hamas never played a serious role in helping build the mass movements known as intifadas. Instead, like the earlier days of Fatah and the PLO, Hamas always bases itself on acts of individual terrorism. These included assassinations and suicide bombings in public places. Tariq Barkoni has written a thorough history of Hamas called Hamas Contained. In it, he explains that prior to the Oslo Accords, Hamas was committed to a single Islamic-based state throughout the region. Over time, however, Hamas, in practice, accepted the idea of a so-called two-state solution. Not only that, but it tried to follow the road of the Palestinian Authority while criticizing them for doing so. For example, in 2012, Hamas agreed to a ceasefire agreement with Israel. Barconi explains that this agreement, quote, amounted to a security coordination with Israel, which, while vilifying the Palestinian Authority for doing the same in the West Bank. He continues, this allows Hamas to sustain its persistent legacy even when, in practice, it did police, that is to say, suppress the armed struggle. In other words, as Barconi explains, Hamas was headed exactly to where the Palestinian Authority had landed, participation in governing, as the Palestinian Authority was doing in the West Bank. However, Israeli aggression prevented that through its long-term siege of Gaza, whose aim was, as an aide to Israeli Prime Minister Olmert put it, quote, to put the Palestinians on a diet but not make them die of hunger, end quote. A Hamas spokesman complained about that, quote, we are a government under occupation. We do not have governments similar to others in the world. Time and again, Hamas reached a ceasefire in exchange for lessening the blockade agreement with Israel, and time and again, Israel reneged on its part of the bargain. In other words, time and again, Hamas, in the words of Barconi, quote, turned its attention to domestic governance in Gaza and reconciliation talks, end quote, with the PLO. In other words, Hamas tried to head down the Palestine Authority road, but Israel's intransigence blocked them. Now, to continue, Hamas's October 7th attack is just a continuation of its method of individual terrorism, but on steroids. That method, from the start, was simply aimed at pressuring the racist state of Israel to lessen its oppression, rather than aimed at the Palestinian people actually seizing power. Had Israel not been so intransigent, and had the PLO/Palestine Authority not already occupied that political space, Hamas would have ended up where the PLO Palestinian Authority is today. The end result of Hamas's October 7th attack has been an enormous intensification of racist reaction inside Israel and genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza and the West Bank. From putting the people of Gaza, quote, on a diet, Israel is today moving to starving them to death. There are reports of even former liberal Israeli Jews justifying the slaughter of Palestinian children on the grounds of what Hamas did on October 7th. There's no chance that Israel will be overthrown by a real armed struggle from outside. All the Arab states are willing to abandon the Palestinians at the drop of a hat. That's what the Abraham Accords proved. And even if they were not, Israel will fight to the bitter end, up to and including the use of nuclear weapons. And the United States capitalism and the U.S. military will help them. Even if there were any chance that the state of Israel could be militarily overthrown from outside, which there is not, what sort of state would result? How much different would it be from the reactionary Islamic Republic of Iran? Or consider the reaction of Hamas to the death of the mass murderer president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi. While the Iranian people were celebrating, Hamas sent condolences to the Islamic Republic of Iran. To draw some conclusions, given Israeli racism and repression, even the traditional working-class methods of the mass mobilization and mass strike seem almost impossible. That does not mean that all is lost, however. On the contrary, the way forward lies in the best of socialist traditions. 10 years ago, the entire region was ablaze with revolution, the Arab Spring. Those revolutions were limited in scope, however. On the one hand, while the revolution in one Arab country helped set off a similar revolution in another, there was not a systematic drive to coordinate the revolutions through a regional leadership. On the other hand, while the economic conditions formed the backdrop to the revolutions, the economic demands were not made clear. Had they been, it would have led to a discussion of capitalism itself. That means it would have opened the door to a discussion of socialism. Despite those limitations, the Arab Spring even had an effect inside Israel, where it helped inspire housing protests in Tel Aviv. Now, it's true that those protests did not take up the issue of Palestinian rights, but it shows what a deeper and more profound rebellion in that part of the world, what effect it could have on Israel itself. In the final part of this series, we will discuss the perspectives for such a rebellion and how that could affect Israel.